Hey everybody, and welcome to LogTech Live. I'm your guest host, Brian Glick from Chain.io here today. Eric is off, I believe, playing Quidditch at Harry Potter World this week, so hope he's having a lot of fun. And we're going to take you through a little bit of news today. Promise you're still going to get a dad joke, so all of you who just tune in for that, be prepared to groan just as much as you would if Eric was here. And again, thank you very much to Eric, so we can watch this when it's recorded, for having me on and letting me sit in for him today. So with that, why don't we dive right into the news? And so our first article today, we're actually pulling from CFO Dive. So we're going to go a little bit outside of supply chain, but we're going to bring it back here, which is the gap that CFOs are seeing between their environmental and social governance requirements that are coming and their actual activity inside their companies. And the reason that this is so important to all of us in LogTech is that the biggest topic in this area right now, in the US at least, is the SEC's pending regulations to put carbon emissions reporting into the requirements for public companies' quarterly and annual reports. And in doing that, it is going to, because of a thing called Scope 3, push that out to all companies needing to get carbon emissions data from their transportation providers. So if you're in a freight forwarder, you're in any kind of transportation provider, if you're not thinking about carbon and thinking about how you are going to provide CO2 related data to your customers, you're going to be in for a problem, because even if you're not selling to public companies, the public companies are going to be asking your customers for that data, because what this really is going to do is create a knock-on effect all the way through the industry to make CO2 data just as important as all of the other type of information that's on your typical bill of lading. So definitely something to be aware of and keep on your radar. I think we can move on to the next one. Also, a little bit of ESG related information here, but I included this one just because it's kind of cool. We are looking at continued development of nuclear reactors for nuclear powered cargo ships. Again, this would be it's got a lot of upsides, a lot of downsides, but it's something that I kind of feel like when I was a kid, we all just assumed the world would be here at a certain point. Certainly a lot of risk, but just think it's super neat. And, the ability to have carbon-free vessels that effectively, run forever. There was another post on LinkedIn related to this, from Inez Nastali over at S&P, talking about the lack of collaboration in ESG, and that different companies are really going it alone with alternative fuels and all of these things. And it made me think, as I was looking at this article, that when we built the atomic bomb, that there was the Manhattan Project here in the U.S., and there was this great bringing together of all of the minds to solve the problem, and that is very different than what we're seeing today, which is a lot of private companies trying to do really interesting things, but effectively going it alone and building everything in the private sector instead of a single sort of government-led or group-led initiative that really brings all the minds together to solve the carbon problem in our industry. So a lot of angles to this one. Obviously, anytime you talk about nuclear and the risk there's trade-offs, but something that I just found really fascinating. So I think we can move on to the next one. This one, I snuck in something from one of my teammates over at Chain.io. Conrad is one of our developers, and he put together an interesting blog post on Chain.io blog, which I would suggest everyone subscribe to, about undisrupting the supply chain. And what Conrad talks about in this article is the need to understand our business, that there are innovations that happen in greenfields, in areas where there wasn't an industry before. You build something entirely new, or you build something inside of a single company, you build a product that you can just take to market, that is really ripe for just pure disruption. But then when you look at an industry like ours, where there's a ton of collaboration and a ton of complexity, and it's to quote Conrad, an industry that's as old as civilization, you can't just disrupt. You have to work within the understandings of the industry and move it forward. We're not going to clear the deck of everyone's global supply chain and just start over. So it's a really interesting perspective from someone on our tech team who day in and day out is building the connections to all the other software in the industry and sees that people who sometimes take disruption a little too far or a little too excited about breaking things can be unsuccessful in our industry, and people who understand that you have to work in a collaborative way inside of supply chain, just by definition, that's what we do. We pass things between competitors and pass things amongst competitors. That is an absolute requirement of innovation here in supply chain. And with that, moving on, talking about competitors and collaboration and bringing things together, there's been a lot of funding news this week. First off, we have Shipamax was acquired by WiseTech, the makers of CargoWise. So Shipamax, for those of you who don't know, is an AI-based document automation and processing engine for taking paper documents that have come in over email and different sources of data and turning it into the shipments that you would need in CargoWise, or reading commercial invoice data and turning that into the data that you can process from a PDF that you might get from a supplier. So this is what you would consider a tech acquisition where it becomes likely a feature of the CargoWise platform at some point, and they will work to integrate this in. And what we will start to see, I think, more of based on the funding environment. And when we get Christian from TradeLens on, we'll talk about this a little bit more. But we will likely see more of these over the next year as the stock markets have brought tech valuations down quite a bit. By some estimations, 2/3, which is going to make it a little more attractive sometimes for larger companies to go invest in buying a company to make a feature inside of their ecosystem instead of building something themselves or trying to compete with a up and coming upstart that has some overlap to them. So congratulations to Jenna over at Shipamax and her team. And the last one, which we didn't get a screen cap up yet for because it just dropped yesterday, was Project 44 raised another $80 million. There was some discussion about whether they would be going public soon. And again, with the market conditions, I think you will see a number of companies who can kind of filling up their coffers and building up more cash in the bank, essentially, to get through what looks like it might be a bit of a rough economy. So expect to see a little bit more of that, little more activity, I would say, of instead of big, massive funding announcements, you're going to see more acquisitions. You're going to see more companies doing little add-on rounds. And certainly $80 million is not little, but in the grand scheme of their company, it is not it's not the game-changing number, but it's very wise investment to make sure that they have the capital to continue to support their customers going forward. And with that, why don't we bring in Christian Hammer, who's joining us from TradeLens. And Christian, good to see you.
Good to see you, Brian. Always a pleasure.
And you're out on the West Coast, so sorry for waking you up so early.
Yeah, well, at this point, 7 a.m. is pretty late for me.
So I know you had some thoughts and maybe a slightly different perspective based on who's in the round for P44. So
yeah, AP Moeller Holding was one of the lead investors on this round, and actually, I see that as a very good thing. Actually, back to the nuclear reactor on the ship piece, I think it's tied to the greening of this industry. We know that the industry is one of the major polluters, and there's a big push on all fronts to do a better job, be more efficient, and all of that. I was actually surprised by the nuclear reactor thing not being on cargo container ships already, because the USS Enterprise and the Reagan and the Gerald Ford, like the big aircraft carriers, have been doing it since the 70s. And so it's a known and stable, reliable technology, but maybe it just needs to be miniaturized for the smaller form factor. But that investment is really consistent with AP Moeller doing everything they can to green up the industry. So I welcome it and think it's a good sign.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's really fascinating that I didn't do that on purpose, but almost everything we just talked about in the news has to do with environmental, social governance, taking care of the planet, and that we do really seem to be turning from a point of talking, kind of moaning about having to do it to doing something. And I was wondering if you kind of agree with that or.
As an industry, because you've got, at least with the shipping lines, they've got these massive assets that are very expensive to buy, and they're also very expensive to operate. It's hard for them to make a commitment to, on the order of many billions of dollars to change that. And so they're going to be slow to do it. Anything that's pushing that forward, anybody making any commitment to move forward on transforming that portion of the industry, it's going to take time. It's going to be slow and it's going to seem frustrating. But I think that the rest of us, some of the reasons we're here are for exactly that reason. I left Wayfair to come to TradeLens because Wayfair was recognizing that there was this problem right in the middle of the pandemic where we were just in time like everybody else. We didn't keep things on the shelf, which meant we had no inventory the day that COVID disrupted the supply chain, and we had nothing coming in, and our sales doubled. And for me, that was both a very positive thing and a very negative thing, right? I've got nothing inbound. How the hell am I going to sell it? And I've got, everything I can going out the door. And there was this click moment where I went, oh my God, wait a second. We're just selling sofas and chairs and, candlestick holders. But what about the person, what about the grocery store? What about the person that's sitting at home, can't go out? They're not gonna be able to work. They need food. They need, the essentials of life. And this industry is what feeds that. It's what allows our civilization to exist. And to your undisrupting the supply chain article, your employee that wrote that's exactly right. This is where civilization was created, and it's what is the backbone of that civilization. So on the front of greening it and trying to become more sustainable, for our civilization to continue to exist, we have to. And making it more efficient and being in the center of it is why I came here, got heavily involved in this industry. So it's all consistent. I think that there's a lot of momentum going that way, and you're going to see a lot more of it.
So one of the other articles we talked about was about disruption, right? And I kind of have two questions for you here. So I'm gonna actually start. I want to ask you, before you were even at Wayfair, you were at Nike, and the way that we think about footwear and athletic footwear and the category of sneakers as something other than the thing you wear to play basketball or wear at the gym, didn't exist when our parents were kids. Like the entire concept, and then that disruption of the swoosh and I will put a plug in. We got TPM Tech coming up in February, and I know I've been teasing on social media. These awesome non-Nikes are not the ones that I'm going to be wearing on the stage, but I'm going to promise everyone that the ones I'm going to be wearing will be better than these. But I do want to ask you, sort of, you had that experience, you worked in that culture, and you're now at TradeLens, which sort of opened with this very disruptive perspective on the industry from day one. Kind of, how have you juxtaposed? What have you seen as far as kind of your thoughts on disruption in tech and in supply chain?
Yeah, at the very beginning of my career, I was all in on disrupt everything all the time. The internet was a brand new thing. The whole world was open to us, and everybody seemed inefficient and ineffective. As I've gotten older and I've had more experiences of the life, there, you find that in a lot of places there's some amazing things happening, and there's complexities that you couldn't imagine. And so, to your point in that article, sometimes it's not about disrupting in that sense, like blow it all up, start over. Sometimes it's actually much more about what is the change and how can we positively use that change. If it's a new technology that came out or if it's a new concept that came in, how can we take that and apply it to what we do to make us better at what we do? So the undisrupting thing for me was a great article. I thought it was really thoughtful. Go ahead.
No. Keep going. Absolutely not.
I will talk for like 4 hours on this.
I want you to. Good.
Yeah.
So Eric does this all the time. I need you to help me fill.
Okay. On the like Nike is an interesting story on that front too, because they do believe in challenge all their own assumptions, disrupt everything all the time on themselves, and it's how they stay in front of the pack. Because in the sporting goods apparel industry, there's lots of competitors, and they're coming in all the time. Under Armour for them was a big wake up call on apparel, because up until that point they owned the category. They were the only one making it, and then all of a sudden this company from, I don't remember, New England comes in.
Baltimore.
And
Baltimore is,
okay,
sorry, they're an old customer of mine, and they are very proud of their Baltimore roots. So we'll give them that
yeah,
one at least. Go
Baltimore, yeah.
ahead.
They came in and they started doing a better job. They'd found ways to disrupt it in a positive way, and it made Nike reevaluate their way of approaching it. I think that there's some interesting changes that will come out of COVID for some companies, maybe Nike included, where they're starting to look at reversing their supply chain. So not being so dependent on importing from Asia or from anywhere else, but like doing more localized manufacturing. And their first foray into that happened like 15 years ago with the Nike ID product, the custom design shoe. Well, you can't do that and get it to a person rapidly unless it's close to them. And so how do you do micro manufacturing on a much closer basis so that you can get it to the customer fast and you can do custom? I think you're going to see more of that start to occur too. And so there's going to be disruptions that happen in the industry that are just tweaks to processes to become more efficient, leveraging technologies, leveraging concepts. But there's also going to be those disruptions that come from outside that are much more on the, hey, we need to rethink how we do this thing called global, these global brands. We need to rethink how we manufacture, how we distribute, et cetera. And with the rise of the advanced manufacturing technologies like CNC machines and 3D printers and all that, robotics and all that, there's a lot more access to it, but it's still a big capital outlay. So it won't happen overnight.
So when I started working with supply chain management in large wearing apparel companies back in 2000 timeframe, right? They were moving away from spreadsheets was sort of the big step, right? People, I won't drag them on a live stream, but one of the big, say, top 5 apparel companies was managing their inbound international supply chain on someone's desktop on a Microsoft Access database. At the time, and we brought them into the modern world, but there's a lot of that was a lot of pain to do that, and it was driven by the fact that suddenly they were sourcing from 5 places instead of one. What kind of tech does it take to get these companies and their visibility and all this collaboration to work when you are potentially talking about now sourcing literally everywhere, because you're going to be locally manufacturing not just in the US, but in all the markets you serve? Like how does TradeLens play into that?
Well, I think TradeLens and Chain.io have a very like a lot of symbiotic nature on that front. We believe that you have to meet them where they are. You're not going to go into a very complex organization and manage the change necessary to adopt a new technology. You've got to meet them where they are. So if they're using spreadsheets, how do we take that spreadsheet and adapt it into like the canonical data model that represents the interconnect between all the other parties? How do we do that? How do we meet them where they are and use the tools that they're already using? So that's like way in Chain.io's wheelhouse, right? That's what you guys do, is you connect those parties. The next part of it then is like, if I can get the interaction happening where I already know how to do it, I'm already using these tools, great. That now has to talk to everything else in the supply chain. Again, Chain.io's wheelhouse. But getting the visibility to all the parts and making it so that you can do something with that, because it's not just about visibility. It's about like, I need to know when I need to act. Truck wasn't available, I need to get a new truck out there. The container's going to be late, container's sitting on a dock, whatever it is, right? I need to know, and I need to be able to act on it. And I think that's the first step, is just you meet them where they are using the tools they have, you inform them when they need to act, and then eventually that turns into a like learn what they're doing to predict and act before that they need to. So when something's going to occur, you automate the system to respond before you have to have a human intervention. And that's how you will start to make it more efficient, more resilient over time. But trying to go in and change their processes is not doable.
So I know you're not here to pitch, and we're really here to hang out today. But I am going to ask you some. I do want to ask you a very specific trade lens question because I know that the audience is fascinated, right? The industry is fascinated by this thing that seemed to rise up out of these large corporations and has now become its own, gotten its own momentum. Um, what is TradeLens? What is the really the mission here, and what are you guys working on?
Yeah, we're here to foster collaboration between all the different parties in the industry by creating that seamless interconnect that allows data transfer between parties. That is a terrible way of describing what we try to do, but we're really here to foster collaboration just for innovation. So we're big on everybody's a partner, nobody's nobody's a competitor. How do we pull it together so we can do more together? We work with parties like the DCSA to form standards on the data model and be able to share the data in a way that makes sense. We have products like there's so many physical documents in global trade. And for me, like as an outsider coming in from much more like the consumers, the importers, moving into a space where I'm like in the middle of this industry now, I was shocked that this industry's been around since civilization began. I was shocked by how little it's changed since civilization began. And there's all these opportunities to step in. And so one of them for us is the elimination of paper, and because it's just unnecessary. So how do we insert ourselves into we have the EBL product, which is now adding on different use cases, going beyond single transfer and into like financial transactions and all that. So we're really focused in on that, and then helping the carriers serve their customers better because they're in the market to move goods. They're not really in the customer support side of the world and making sure you know what's going on. So even answering the simple question, where are my containers, is not something that they're really equipped to do. And so we insert ourselves there to help them with that as well.
So what has it been like? And I know you've joined TradeLens relatively recently and weren't there day one, but um, how do you pivot a culture or create a culture of innovation disruption in an organization that has its roots in Maersk and IBM, two of the largest, two organizations that legitimately could be countries if they just consolidated all their people in one spot. So.
It's not easy. I won't pretend that it is, because there's a lot of embedded momentum in an organization of that scale. That's from the way that people are incentivized to do things, what they're measured against, all of that. It's very compartmentalized and, in its way, very efficient. Like when you have a big organization, it's much more efficient to give everybody a narrow task and to focus. But that's where you lose innovation, because that's when you cross the boundaries and you have cross-pollination of ideas that you bring it in. So how do you create that space where, hey, I'm over here in this part of the business, I have this problem. Does anybody have any ideas? Like there's a lot of technology tools you can use to enable that, and you just try to get the conversation started and make it safe to do so. That usually starts with leadership and a commitment from the highest levels of the organization to say, yeah, we're going to make it okay to do it, and we're going to ask you to get involved. We're going to give you the time to do it. We're going to make it safe to do it, and we're going to let you take risks. But in a large organization, taking risks has a lot bigger blast radius than in a tiny little company. And so, like, how do we contain that risk? How do we give people an appropriate amount of resources to chase it? How do we give them the appropriate amount of time to do something with it, but not risk the whole business in doing so? And so that's, with Nike, one of the things that we did that I loved is we started doing hackathons as kind of a proof of concept way of doing it. But we created a place where people could say, hey, here's my problem. Does anybody have any ways to, help me with it? And the whole, conversation would happen. And then they'd get together at lunch because they had one day a week where they could go work on projects like this. And then they'd come to a group that we treated ourselves kind of like angel investors. And they'd come in and say, hey, we have this solution we believe that's going to solve this big problem. Here's the opportunity space. Can we go forward? And we'd say, yeah, that sounds great. Here's 20 engineers, go. Or whatever it took to do it. Nike ID actually came out of that. That's so the sneaker app and a bunch of others. But that's how you do it. But it takes a concerted, long commitment from senior leadership to really get there. Alternatively, you can sequester a small team away and like lob things over the wall at them and say, here's a really hard thing that we can't figure out how to do, go do it. And then you try to impart that back on the organization. And that's just fraught with risk. You don't have the buy-in from the people that are on the trenches. You don't, there's, you miss a lot of context. So that rarely works. The incubator within a company, if it works in isolation, rarely actually does any innovation. It has great ideas, but it doesn't deliver. So making it part of the culture is what you have to do.
I think it's interesting how the perspective of where you work can influence some thoughts on that stuff. You're talking about the blast radius, right? And that the blast radius of an innovation in a large company can be very large. As someone who has a smaller company, I actually think about it in the inverse, and think about the fact that you can take that team or that idea. If Nike ID had failed, right? If it said, "Oh, the tech doesn't work, we can't deliver on time," and it never made it to market, nobody would have ever known, right? That Nike would not have failed. When you're in a small business and you go and you take those innovations, and we actually are in our budgeting process this year, for next year, and we're not certainly a tiny business, but we're still at this stage where when we make bets, one of the decisions we have to make is, do we spread them, or do we put does everything go on 8? Do we bet everything on number 8 and roll the dice and see what happens? And that is a interesting thing that I think also ties back to kind of the Shipamax story and the WiseTech acquisition, and is that you have these very targeted companies that now are going to really see if these bets come off in a tougher environment. Right? There's just so much innovation, so much tech developed, and it's going to be really fascinating for me, at least, to see, for those companies who stayed very, very focused. Not every bet's going to land, but the ones that do are going to be huge because their competitors are going to disappear over the next couple of years. So I think the funding market plays into that quite a bit.
It does. It's not necessarily always true that the company with the largest pile of money is going to win, but there is a strong correlation.
It doesn't hurt.
Two things. Yeah.
So what other tech or what have you been looking at that you're excited about?
Well, there's so many things. There's a lot of the Web3 technology that's really fascinating to me. I don't.
Can you explain what Web3 is for some of the audience?
Oh,
I know that's a harder question than it sounds like. But.
Yeah, it's actually for the way I think about it, it's returning a lot of the web to its roots, getting back to the distributed web versus being centralized, which is a lot of what happened during the Web 2.0 phase, where these big companies like in social media, you had Facebook and Twitter and a few others that consolidated all the users in one place, and there was like this separate internet that happened there. That was what happened in Web 2. Web 3 is trying to return to like, nope, it's a Wild West free for all. Not quite that bad, but it's back and open. So there's a lot of technologies that enable that. Blockchain, so the cryptocurrencies were kind of one version of the blockchain. But that definitely fits into that category. A lot more peer-to-peer. So instead of going to some service that I'm going to, sharing information directly without going through some middle service or middleman. There's a lot of it there, but for me, it's really about that aspect. It's about getting back to a distributed, open web.
So one of the conversations that happened in the logistics space, sort of 2018, 2019, before we all got distracted, there was, I don't know, some level of disruption in 2020. But prior to that was about this idea. I used to hear people sort of complaining before we would get on panels and before we would get on stages, backstage, about, all of this sort of Web3 type stuff, and that word wasn't really used yet. I could just buy Nexus, right? And just sort of like I just need a database, and I don't need it to be distributed, and I don't actually need this democratization of the data, as long as I have a better database. What do you think? Why is it different? Why is that wrong? Why is that at least wrong at some degree?
Well, anytime you have one point of like one point where all the information gets stored, or one system that owns it all, you run into that's also the single point of failure that can cause the whole thing to fall apart. So you've taken your risk, and instead of having it distributed and broken up into smaller pieces, you have it all in one spot. which makes it an attractive target for international or governmental cyber crime and things like that. Like, there are certain countries that are actively trying to disrupt things like supply chains as a tool of war, and it makes it a single point for them to attack. It also means that like simple mistakes that happen in any technology organization can have a massive, back to the blast radius, they can have a massive impact. And so being able to break it up into small compartmentalized zones makes it less of a potential point of threat, as well as a much lower risk profile from failure point of view. But that, I mean, you can do that with things that don't require you to use Web 3.0 technology. That's basically the whole premise behind chaos engineering and the movement towards microservices that we've been doing for 20 years. It's just it's taking it a full step further.
I think one of the things that I'm a little jealous of you on is you get this really interesting perspective working with very large organizations. I had put a opinion piece in JOC a week or two ago about the government's need to support small businesses and the perspective of small businesses with things like the Flow Initiative and visibility coming into the country, and how that the needs are so different. But I think you just brought something to mind for me that's really fascinating, and probably for a lot of us in the audience who don't work with the largest companies on earth, is that as a small company just importing 50 containers or 500 containers or even 5,000 containers, you don't think about nation state actors and the risk profiles, right? But if you're Samsung, right, and you're thinking about the security of those chips and the injection inside of the supply chain of things that could destroy countries, right? And I would imagine that gets into some pretty fascinating conversations with your customers that some of us don't get to be party to. Is that stuff fun? Or exciting? I don't know what the right word is there.
It's so funny because like TradeLens sits as this small company between some major companies, some of the biggest on the planet, and we're this little tiny party in between. So yeah, it does bring up some interesting conversations. I do have the background that helps with this. I did a period of time like after the first .com bubble burst in whatever the hell was 2000. I went and worked for the largest government contractor I could find and did development of systems for the big geometrically shaped building in Washington D.C. as a contractor, and so like that was my first real introduction to it. And then when I went and started working for larger companies to bring that innovative, digital first mindset in, I would use the term naive on myself coming in, because I was disrupt everything. Why can't you move faster? Why, like I had that very strong view that you're failing because you're not risking it all every day. And then when I saw what the risk profile really looks like on a global international company that does something like chip manufacturing, I don't like the fact that we're like, I don't like building weapons, for example. It's not something that I went into life doing, but to recognize that those chips end up in guided missiles, and when they're not available, that's a threat to an entire hemisphere of the world. That's an eye-opening experience, and it makes you rethink a lot. It's like, okay, to the undisrupting supply chain article again, like, wait a second, we do need to innovate. We do need to move faster. We do need to solve all these problems that seem almost intractable sometimes, but at what cost? What are we willing to risk to do it? And being able to then compartmentalize that risk as much as possible. Totally different way of thinking. Mm-hmm. And having your eyes open to it, and then being in the conversations on a regular basis where that's what we talk about, it really does change the way you approach it.
I remember when President Obama became president, one of the tech articles that was floating around a lot of, or topics, was how frustrated he was that he couldn't sort of keep his phone, and that they made him use a much less cool phone. I know subsequent presidents have had different approaches to this, but that idea of having to understand that security and discipline, and it's something we actually deal with a lot at Chain.io because we are mission critical infrastructure, right? We are not the disruptive startup that can just go play around. We would have major, freight forwarders and carriers whose websites would stop working, whose, shipments would stop moving if our data stopped moving around. We think about that too, of like, what's the difference between it's cool and it's transformative and important, and that cool doesn't always get to win when you're not in the consumer space.
Yeah, as much as you want it to. It sounds so, it sounds fun. I want to do it so much. It sounds like such a cool thing to go after, and then to be able to have to say, but we're not going to do it, and here's why. That was a hard thing for me to absorb too, because like the thing that attracts me about the Web 3.0 stuff is that it's like, it's cool. It's going back to the roots of why I got involved in the first place, all of that. But then you look at some of it and go, yeah, but like that's going to create all of this downstream impact in a negative way. And I don't know how to contain that yet. And so why risk that? But other pieces of it might be absolutely exactly right.
So a couple call outs from the comment thread here. Larry not corrected us, but was more specific as he usually is. It was a BlackBerry that the president did not want to give up at the time. So, which is also probably a company where this is an entire another set of lessons about continuous disruption and not sitting on your laurels. But that was the tech. So, and then Audrey made a comment that I think talks to the next step of disruption, which is, I said, digital literacy is huge, and most tools are underused as companies launch main features, and effectively that change management is the other piece of this, right? And I would imagine, whether, I know Wayfair is quite large, Nike is bigger, and the companies that you're working with as your customers and investors today are even bigger than that. What's change management feel like as a tech leader, trying to herd these cats? Sorry, I don't want to give you PTSD so early in the morning, but
what does it feel like? It is the most frustrating thing I've ever had to deal with in my life. No, I guess because I started life as a turbo nerd. Like I was into computers before people really had them everywhere. I was like, I know you were too, Brian. And I was always super curious. Something new would come along and I wanted to know it and I wanted to understand it. And I found my first interaction with people that weren't that difficult. It was like, why aren't you digging in and trying to understand this really cool thing? Like, it's so cool. Why aren't you nerding out with me? But everybody's got their own perspective on things. What's important to them is different, and that's all great. Change management is really just connecting people to whatever this thing is helps them be better, or helps them be more successful, or helps them be happier, whatever it is. You're just trying to connect them to that. That means it's always personal. And everybody's job, when you come in and you disrupt it, you're basically either saying it's not important because we're going to do away with it and automate it with technology, or you come in and say, hey, I'm going to make you better at it, and here's how we're going to do that. So it's always that personal thing. It took me a while to realize that. I made a lot of mistakes along the way, as we all do. But
I will share 100% true story from very early in my career. When I was a teenager, I used to install computers at law firms, and often they were the first computers at those law firms, right? And every legal secretary had the same device on their desk. They had an IBM Selectrix typewriter, which would have 256 characters of memory, and then it would type it so they could, correct mistakes. And they loved these things. Like, they're passionate about these typewriters. And my job as a teenager was to go into the office, look this person in the eye, and say, I am taking away your typewriter. And I am putting this box, these 3 boxes, this big box, this another box on top that's going to be the screen, this printer. All of this equipment is going to replace your one nice, simple typewriter that you love more than anything in the world. And those keys feel right to you, and all of these things. And the histrionics and the just the like clinging and like the moments where like I genuinely like would have to go get the partners from the law firm, be like, you have to go get involved in this. I can't get this person to part with this thing or get out of her chair so that I can get in the way and actually take it away. What I learned was that I developed a trick. I think one of the other people showed me was you would put the PC together next to it, and you would open it and you would show them solitaire. And there was two reasons to do that. One, because it would show them how to use the mouse, but two, because the typewriter didn't have solitaire, right? And
That was a good trick.
it
Yeah.
made that, but it made that connection, right? It was,
Yeah.
here's something you care about that I can give you that is not, you have to do this. It's, let me show you this little Easter egg or this little bonus that you're going to get in your life from this tool, right? And whether that's that or whether that's, a CargoWise salesperson now walking in and saying, hey, we added the Ship-a-Max functionality. And you're not going to have to retype that document anymore. You're just going to forward it into the system, and you can spend your time doing things other than retyping all of those commercial invoices. Like, making it personal, like you said, really does matter when it comes to change management. So,
as far as I can tell, with human beings, it's the only thing that matters.
we are not, as Scott Amsler said, we're not wet computers, right? We actually have, there's some nuance there. We're about to wrap up here. So any other exciting news you want to share, or things that you're really looking forward to, or news articles that we may have missed?
Are there news articles we missed? Well, there's a lot going on all the time, and there's a lot of innovation constantly coming, and I'm always excited to see more. And so if people want to leave it in comments, they want to email me, they want to connect in some way to talk about it, I'd love to hear what you're doing. If you've got a small innovative thing that you're out there and you're working on that you think can help either green the industry or help us become more efficient or whatever, I'd love to hear it personally. And so I make myself available for outreach on that front, because I'm very much of I started my life as a startup founder. I went through that entrepreneurial journey for a very long time, and I'm very passionate about that, and I want to help it as much as I can. And I feel like this industry in some ways is the last major zone that really is full of opportunities. They're just everywhere. You look around and go, wow, we could do this, we could do that, we could do that. And finding the passion and finding the people that care to dive into each of those spots is something I love. That's why I'm here.
Well, I know anyone who wants to reach out to you, and you and I have these talks, as I'm sure people can tell all the time when we don't have an audience. But Christian's on LinkedIn. It's chammer1. If you want to make sure you're getting to the right Christian on LinkedIn. Thanks so much for being here. I'm gonna keep you on the screen here for the last thing we do on the show. Eric usually lets the guests go, but I feel like I need a live audience and a live reaction for the dad joke of the month, which is a key part of the show. So, Christian, what makes shipping jokes so funny?
I don't know. What makes shipping jokes so funny?
It's all in the delivery. And thank you very much for that. That was exactly the reaction we were all looking for. And thanks everyone for listening in today and joining us. And Eric will be back, we hope, assuming that he doesn't fall off of his Quidditch and survives Harry Potter world. So we will see you all soon. Thank you.